This is the second part of a discussion of externalities of car manufacturing from pollution. So go watch the other one if you haven't. All right, so we have this policy. Remember that it's equivalent to either tax the producer $1,000 for each car and give that money to the people who are affected, or to have the neighbors pay the firm $1,000 for each car they don't produce, which is probably a really hard thing to have a contract for. Like, how many cars didn't you produce? Well, that depends on what your starting point is. And clearly, if there's an agreement between the neighbors and the producers to pay $1,000 for each car not produced, the firm has an incentive to lie. Well, so do the neighbors, probably. They both have an incentive to give estimates of the equilibrium point that are wrong. So the producer would say, well, if we didn't have this, we would have produced 12 cars, so now you need to pay us for each of those 12 cars we didn't produce, when in reality they would have produced 4. But if they say they would have produced 12, then they get paid more. Okay, so that's not a great solution, and that's why we tend to not see these in practice. Well, that's one of the reasons. The other is that usually the group of neighbors is a fairly large group, and so if this is 100,000 people in some town, 100,000 neighbors, and there's $1,000 of worth of pollution for each car, well, that's not a lot of money per person. So what's the incentive for the neighbors to put in effort to solve this problem? Well, if they're all equally affected by the pollution, no one of them is probably going to find it that it's worth their time and their energy to organize to solve this problem. I'm not blaming them. I'm not saying they're just being lazy or something. I'm saying it's not efficient for any given individual to try to solve this problem, because each individual doesn't gain much by solving the problem, whereas collectively they gain a lot, which is why we tend to see government solutions to these things. I've heard from other professors that some of the students get annoyed when they suggest that governments can do anything. It's not a controversial claim. Governments can do things. Whether you like what they do or not is a different matter. Whether government is going to efficiently solve this particular problem, I don't really know. There are some cases where governments can improve efficiency, and there are some cases where the government action itself is inefficient in other ways, and so it won't increase the efficiency. So, for instance, if government imposes a tax on this firm but then just throws the money in the trash, that's not great, right? So it really does depend on how the policy is implemented, because there are other costs. But let's assume it's costless. In that case, if it's costless for the government to impose this tax, we know it's not costless for the neighbors to organize, and so we're more likely to get a government solution to this. But we can still imagine either one. So let's think about the tax first. So the tax essentially adds to the marginal cost for the firm. So for each car they make, they have to pay $1,000 in extra costs. Okay? But that's not the only effect here. We should look over here at the neighbors. So what do the neighbors get if this firm produces the car? Well, they get another $1,000, right? They're getting paid for each of these cars. Okay, so that's a benefit to them. Because they're being compensated for the pollution, they gain $1,000 for it. But of course, it costs them $1,000 each time. Okay, so they don't really end up winning from this, unless you're someone who thinks that the firm had a right to that pollution and that the neighbors did not have a right to not live under pollution, in which case this cost to the neighbors is one that they bore at their own peril And so again, these aren't moral claims when I say cost and benefits. These are just descriptions of the things that influence behavior. This $1,000 is a thing that influences the behavior of the neighbors, and this other $1,000 of benefit is a thing that influences the behavior of neighbors. No moral claims there. Okay? So the neighbors look at this and they say, okay, sure, works for me. And then what happens in the market? Well, if we look over here, is it the case that the sellers would be willing to sell this fourth car? You should pause this video right now and ask yourself, will the sellers still be willing to sell this fourth car? Look at the numbers in the table, particularly these numbers here, and decide how many cars the sellers will be willing to sell. Okay? Did you do that? Did you pause? Did you solve the question? Come on, go do it. I'll give you a cookie. Oh, that's not true. I lied. Okay, so, well, they will not. And we can see that here. So, if they sold the fourth car, it would cost them $5,000 to make it, and they'd only get paid at most $4,000. That's the most consumers are willing to pay for it because that's the marginal value to the consumers. Okay, so we know that they will not sell that fourth car. They'll sell 3 cars here. The problem in this case is that we have these whole numbers of cars. Again, remember, you can actually have fractions of cars because demand and supply are about flows over time. Like you can produce half a car per day. If it takes you 2 days to make a car, that means half a car per day. So we're not constrained to 3 and 4 and 5 and stuff like that. We could have 3.1, 3.2, and so on between these. So we know that if they sell the third car, it costs the firm $4,000 to make it, and the consumers are willing to pay $5,000. So, will that transaction happen? Will the firm that's running this factory sell this third car? This is another case where you should pause and answer this question. Will they sell the third car? It costs them $4,000 to make it, and people are willing to pay $5,000 for it. Okay. Hopefully you've unpaused with an answer, and hopefully your answer is yes, they will sell this third car, because people are willing to pay them more than it costs them. Okay? So we know they'll sell at least 3 cars, and what will actually end up happening is that they'll sell somewhere between 3 and 4 cars, because here the marginal cost is still below the marginal benefit, so they can probably do a little better by making a little more than 3 cars per day. So this would be cars per day, this quantity, for instance. So if they can do a little bit better by making, say, 3.2 cars per day, which might cost them $4,500, and the marginal benefit to consumers might be $4,500, then that's what they do. And then they'd make 3.2 cars per day. And they'd pay a tax of 0.2 times $1,000 on that 0.2 car. Or really, in reality, they'd pay $1,000 whenever they're done making the car. But on average per day, they'd pay 0.2 times $1,000 in tax on that. Okay, so the point here is that we've reduced the quantity, and that the reason why the quantity was reduced is that the producer internalizes this cost. So this cost, I don't know why I did this one in orange and this one in orange. Really, this cost is this cost over here. And we've made the neighbors stop bearing it by giving them this $1,000 to compensate. And we've made the firm start bearing it by taxing them this $1,000. So the key idea of policies to respond to externalities is to get the people who are making the choices to internalize the cost and benefits. So that is the main idea here. So the policy for externalities, in most cases, there are some alternatives, but the main ones are ones that, I'm going to use a different color because black doesn't stand out well here. Get people in the market. Who is actually in the market? Well, the consumers and the producers, not the neighbors. Ooh, that's a T. to internalize all costs and benefits. Okay. So once we have this policy that essentially transfers $1,000 from the producer to the consumer, or not, sorry, from the producer to the neighbors every time they make a car, that means that no longer is it the case that there's this externality on the neighbors. Instead, this is entirely now private costs and benefits. So this tax amount here, this is a private cost. This $4,000, that's a private benefit. These things are all private costs and benefits. There are no externalities involved here. And so the idea is to turn all those public and external costs and benefits into private costs and benefits so that the people who are making these choices end up making the efficient choice. And that's what we did here with this tax. It is now the case that the firm internalizes or bears this cost that was previously an external cost. So this is why we tend to tax negative externalities. So the general pattern is tax negative externalities and to, well, what do you think we do with positive externalities? This would be a case for you to pause the video and think to yourself, what would we do with positive externalities? Well, we subsidize them. I'm not going to write out the whole word. There we go. Okay? So this was for the tax case, but remember that the case where the neighbors pay the firm to not produce is exactly the same so long as they can get the contract down right. So long as they know that they're paying them to produce less than 4, which is really a difficult task. You'd have to know where the equilibrium is. You might base it on past production, but do you think it's always the case that the average of past production will be the current equilibrium? Seems unlikely. If demand for cars increases one day, then that will give us a new equilibrium, and it will no longer be the case that the firm would have produced 4 cars. So I don't want to make this too difficult, but suppose the demand curve shifted out here one day. Well, it's no longer the case that the firm would produce 4 cars in the absence of this payment to the neighbors. So if they had a contract that says, you pay us $1,000, or the firm says to the neighbors, you pay us $1,000 for every car less than 4 we produce, well, what happens now? Well, the new equilibrium is over here, right? So they would have produced more in this case. And so if they end up producing 4 instead of, maybe this would be 5, then they're actually underproducing relative to what the producers think is optimal for them. And so they would like the neighbors to pay them for that choice, but the neighbors have this contract that says, no, we only pay you if you produce less than 4. Okay? So then this is no longer a good solution to that problem. So as long as demand or supply is moving around regularly, we can't use that kind of solution. But there is an alternative, which would be, well, instead of, I should bring those back. Instead of saying, we'll pay you, instead of the neighbors saying to the firm owners, we'll pay you $1,000 for each car you don't produce, it could be, for each car that you produce under 4, we will pay you $1,000 if, for each car over 4, you pay us $1,000. Okay, so that sets what a lot of economists would call the property rights. So that sets the right of the firm to, by right I don't mean anything in terms of something moral, a moral claim. I just mean the right in terms of how we have established who owns things, essentially. So that sets ownership of production for the firm at 4, and if they produce more, they have to compensate the neighbors for that. And if they produce less, the neighbors compensate them for that. So that kind of helps solve the problem and works about the same way as the tax. It's sort of a convoluted solution, though. So another way to do it might be to say, well, so we don't like your pollution, but suppose that you are more conservative and you say, I really like business, okay, and I don't want the government taxing my businesses out of business. Suppose that's how you're looking at this, and you're kind of bothered by this whole discussion. Well, let's think of another policy that might make you happy. So suppose, well, this might not make you happy. It depends on your views on government, probably. Suppose that we say, well, the neighbors are going to give the firm $2,000, just a blank payment of $2,000. You're just paying the company $2,000, which seems kind of absurd, right? But if the company produces a car, they have to pay the neighbors back $1,000. Okay, or let's make it $3,000. So the neighbors pay the company $3,000. So neighbors, I'm just gonna write pay the factory, I'll just call it firm, $3,000, and the firm pays the neighbors $1,000 per car. Okay? So this is another way to distribute the rights, essentially. So the neighbors are agreeing to give the firm $3,000 just for existing, but the firm is agreeing to give the neighbors $1,000 per car. So what would be the outcome? Well, the neighbors lose this $1,000, but it's still the case that each time the firm makes a car, they give up this $1,000, right? So that still changes the cost for them. $1,000 here, $1,000 here, $1,000 here, $1,000 here, and we actually end up getting exactly the same outcome. So the outcome is still that they produce between 3 and 4 cars, and that we end up, I wish I had hit undo, because there's no way to do this without it. Okay. The outcome is still the same, where this is the equilibrium without that policy, but with the policy, they end up producing between 3 and 4 cars, because it costs the firm that extra $1,000 each time they produce a car. And so that shifts the supply curve this way. Okay? And from the neighbor's perspective, what happens? Well, they give up $3,000, but they also get paid $3,000 plus a little bit more, because the firm is producing a little more than 3 cars. So are they fully compensated for these costs? No, they are not. They are not fully compensated for the pollution, but it is still an efficient outcome, because no one could be made better off without somebody else being made worse off, or specifically because we are at this point here. It's an efficient outcome because the marginal benefits are equated to the marginal costs. So here's the marginal cost to the firm of producing that 4th car, and here is the marginal cost to the consumers, or sorry, not to the consumers, to the neighbors when the firm produces that 4th car. So there's production costs and pollution costs. And those together are $5,000, and that's more than this $4,000, so they don't make that 4th car. So this policy over here, it's kind of convoluted, but it still gets us to that efficient outcome. Efficient does not mean moral, it does not mean good, it does not mean fair. Okay? It means the benefits equal the costs. That's it. Okay? So the neighbors end up with pollution and $30, basically. Or a little more than $0, because they paid $3,000, they get a little more. They get $3,000 plus a little more, because there's a little more than 3 cars produced. So from their perspective, they're still not enjoying the pollution, But that's more an issue of the distribution of wealth than it is an issue of efficiency. So there are lots of things we don't like. That doesn't mean they're inefficient. Like, I don't like that if I buy sushi, it doesn't cost me just $1. It costs me more than $1. I don't like that, right? I'm not trying to say that pollution is not a really major thing. It's a definitely a major issue. But if I buy sushi, I would like to pay less for my sushi, right? So from my perspective, I am made worse off by the fact that the price of sushi is higher than $0. But we don't generally think of that as being a market failure in need of government intervention, because the benefits and costs of sushi are balanced against each other. The reason the price is high is that people are willing to pay for that sushi particular amounts, and they're balancing the costs and benefits. In this case, the neighbors are bearing this cost of the pollution, but from the perspective of the designers of this policy here, essentially, they don't have a right to not have the pollution. I know that sounds like a moral claim, but it's not. It's just saying, how have we established what people have a right to by law? So laws establish rights, like you have a right to have others not poke you with sticks, right? And you have what else do you have a legal right to? You have a right to autonomy within your home generally, like the government can't tell you not to use contraceptives, right? So that's a right established by law. If this were a law, the rights established by law would be that the firm can pollute all it wants to, as long as it pays $1,000 and as long as the neighbors pay it this $3,000. Okay? So it's an efficient outcome, not necessarily a moral one, not necessarily a good one, not necessarily one you want, but this would get us to a case where maybe some people would be on board with this policy that would not be on board with the policy of just the second part, right? So if you particularly think that it's not fair to tax the firm for producing cars because that's just what manufacturers do, you might be happier with this policy than with a policy that doesn't include the part about the neighbors paying the $3,000 to the firm. So when we're thinking about policy, we can think first about what will make things efficient. So the first thing you should do is think about the simplest policy that makes things efficient. The simplest policy in this case is tax the company and give it to the neighbors. But is that politically feasible? I don't really know. It depends on the political views of the people in that area who are making those choices. So Alabama, maybe not Birmingham, but Alabama has a lot of fairly conservative people. Birmingham has a lot of less conservative people, particularly more Democratic people in the Birmingham area. By Democratic, I mean Democratic Party, not like pro-democracy. That's not what I mean. So Democratic people will be probably more likely to want just the second part, and I would guess that Republicans might be more likely to want the whole policy. Okay? So how do we actually end up with a policy that makes things more efficient? Well, usually it ends up with some sort of compromise. And so this was my example of a compromise policy. My guess is that this particular policy is not one that would actually happen, but it's sort of like some policies that are sometimes suggested as compromises. All right, let me know if you have questions. I love discussing this stuff with you, and I'm looking forward to more discussion.